This is update for October 11, 2022, day 230 of the war, end of the date update. Today is going to be more of like sort of general topics discussion as opposed to military, as there's not much going on the battleground right now. At least like things are very slow, and it's not what's been going on past, let's say, 5 weeks or 6 weeks since the beginning of September. Nevertheless, but there are many other things that are important. They are equally important, and they will decide the fate of this war. So let's just start with one topic that's probably everybody's knows about. This is today was the second day of Russian attacks on Ukrainian energy infrastructure. There were again more hits, at those powerful transformers, which I call them interconnectors. So this is, I borrowed map from the Russian source, so that's why it's not correctly reflecting Ukrainian territory, but nevertheless, the point is to show what's going on. So this kind of like these icons here are those so-called substations. So basically interconnectors that actually connect the entire system into one single power grid. So as you can see, those ones that are red are being attacked. Then power generating stations also were attacked. Obviously, they did not attack nuclear ones, which is one here, another one here. Then the third one, this is the second biggest one. And then there's another one here, which they don't show, obviously. But this is Zaporizhya is there. Zaporizhya is idle right now, and the electricity is being provided, actually consumes electricity from the Russian grid right now, but it's basically right now connected to Russian grid or Russian controlled grid, let's put this way. So as a result of the second day of attacks, there are essentially rolling blackouts throughout the country, and the black regions where there is essentially pretty much non-stop rolling blackouts. This gray and white partially affected, some areas are affected, some less. So as you can see, this area is less affected. However, the problem is there's not much in terms of industrial capacity, value add here. The same is here, the same is here. Those are pretty low value add or industrial capacity. The same goes true for Odessa region. This Kropyvnytsky region there are some industrial facility, industrial production there. So that's the only sort of kind of like, how to say, positive situation, let's put it this way. What happened is, but the most important part is even the following, that as I mentioned yesterday, this is really puts essentially a final nail in the coffin of Ukrainian economy. At this point, things are completely disastrous. So it's not that the Ukrainian economy at the level of 20-30% of GDP it used to have. At this point, it's close to zero. Let's say 5-10% of GDP. And the most important is that really means that Ukraine will not be able to sustain itself, and it will need more support from the West, financial support specifically, which already putting strains in the West because the economic contraction is underway in the West, even though it's formally not declared as such. But all of the signs are telling us that the recession is happening, and everybody's going to go into much deeper recession going forward. Again, as discussed, that's part of the reason of this fail. Like that's why the contributor to that are those failed energy policies and also internal, fiscal situation in many countries where there's essentially unconstrained creation of credit that's not backed by any production of productive, by goods specifically, and blocking energy resources makes situation is much worse relative to where it is. And also, as everybody knows, China is effectively blocked as a main production facility because its own sort of fight that everybody knows the disease about, which I don't want to mention here. So, but essentially, China doing its own, it's kind of like living in its own world. So it's severely affected. And so, as mentioned before, essentially the world is um, disintegrating in terms of deglobalizing and splitting into several economic blocks that are becoming less and less interconnected. And that actually destroys a lot of value, even though you cannot say that globalization was positive. There is a lot of negative to it, but there is also a lot of positives that frequently omitted, but it created a lot of wealth in the poorer countries, even though still that was not sort of even distribution. There's sort of haves and have-nots, but it still lifted massive number of people out of total like difficult life and poverty. At the same time, there is no denial that it created huge amount of problems as well. So it's not like black or white. There is sort of good parts and there are terrible parts as well to it. So that thing is going kind of like disintegrating, and that's the economic output goes down everywhere in the world, because the only way to achieve that, what we sort of used to have economically, is when the world is sort of like one, right? So it's like one big integrated economic system. If you cut it into pieces, um, it cannot produce the same amount of economic value. In some ways, it actually reminds the situation in the, I think it was 29 or 30 when the Great Depression started, right? And then it was magnified by the actions of the U.S. Parliament that actually put the tariffs on imported goods, essentially blocking them from, going into U.S. And that also kind of like compartmentalized the world, right? So it's to some extent that something similar is happening right now. Obviously, there is no sort of import duty action, but there are actions sort of in China. They own some kind of logic there. Then there is this situation with blocking Russian energy, fight on internal energy producers in in the West. So it all creates all of these issues. And so going back to this horrific situation in Ukraine, financially and economically, to add to all of this, Ukraine not only stopped exporting electricity to Europe, but what it also did is the whole metallurgical complex and all of that mining complex that was one of the biggest pillars of the value add in Ukrainian economy that still managed to survive horrific and economic policies, stopped, essentially shut down, right? Because you didn't have enough electricity, and all of those manufacturing facilities and mining facilities, they are huge consumers of electricity. So that all stops. So that all again means that the flow of foreign currency into Ukraine and just generating wealth has stopped, right? So that makes Ukraine much poorer. Essentially, at this point, there's almost nothing truly competitive and value add left in Ukraine. So that also what can be seen is that there is huge food inflation in Ukraine developing. That in most salaries or whatever incomes people having, they definitely not catching up with that. Having said that, that creates a lot of also sort of pressure and strain in the country, but at the same time. There is kind of like a very unique feature, I guess, about Ukraine is that many people have their own like sort of plots of land where they grow food, and also like sort of they sort of very connected to to agriculture. Even though they could be living in the city, they still have their own plots of land and grow things. So that's sort of the saving grace. So there's not going to be famine or anything like that in Ukraine in a natural way, because there is a lot of even internal food production. But the sort of like this, call it like industrial food production system, is starting to basically industrial agriculture. Let's put this way. It starts to disintegrate in Ukraine as well. So this is going to be based like, so going forward. This is the like agricultural production is going to be more sort of dependent on like small scale producers and more independent farmers, like true farmers. Because in Ukraine, there's a lot of this like industrial farms that are not the farms only in the name. It's really controlled, like like 10,000 hectares, 20, 30, 50,000 hectares, controlled by one person or company, and they basically, this is in just in a simple way, just exploitation of the land by this handful number of people, and destruction actually of the soil fertility at the same time. This is not like sort of unique to Ukraine, but I'm just explaining that this industrial farm system, they're not resilient, and they create problems for the society, but then they also magnify the downfall in the society, because then all of that is going to be that part of the production significantly impaired, like mostly gone. It's actually, I will actually discuss a little bit Ukrainian internet system, how it's actually being built, and it's actually sort of one of the few bright spots in Ukraine relative to the world, where it's extremely decentralized, and it's kind of like a lot of like small scale operators, unlike let's say in the West, where it's all controlled by again sort of kind of like semi monopolization by a handful of companies. In Ukraine, it's very like sort of independent, small independent ones, and that really prevented Ukrainian internet system from collapsing. And it's actually very, I would say, resilient system. So again, this is the same idea as what I was describing agriculture, but I'll discuss that tomorrow in more detail, because that sort of principles, they are applicable and transferable to any industry, anything sort of societal. And that's something that I would say should be as example of how things should be done, as opposed to centralizing everything in the hands of few. So again, so these attacks continue. So this is because I mentioned yesterday that it looked like it was just one-off sort of revenge. It looks like it's actually systematic action by the Russian command, and very clear decision to knock out Ukrainian electricity system, which they almost succeeded in that. It's obviously going to be extremely difficult and horrific going into the winter. At the same time, again, as mentioned before, people have their, like most people or many people have their own stoves, especially if they don't live in the cities. So kind of like in Ukraine, people sort of kept that sort of skill to kind of live off grid to some extent, obviously, and I would say much more than, let's say, in the West. So that's a little bit on the positive. I'm not saying it's a great sort of situation, but that will minimize the blow from all of these actions on the Russian side. But at that point, any kind of discussion about doing any kind of business in Ukraine is a moot point at this point. And I think it's going to be very obvious to anyone in Ukraine who had any hopes going forward that somehow they will be able to sort of manage and survive. It's becoming very clear it's nearly impossible. So that's a situation with Ukraine. the biggest importance of this and I would say success of the Russian attacks is that they destroyed uh, in a way remaining viable sort of businesses, meaning the export of electricity and that metallurgical and mining complex, and also more importantly, they clearly probably shattered hopes in the minds of most sort of entrepreneurial people who are still in Ukraine and try to figure out how to sort of continue life, how to still build something in Ukraine. And that is where the biggest sort of blow, not like in physical destruction of this some of these facilities. Eventually, they will be sort of rebuilt and will be even better ones, hopefully. But the problem is what I just described. Then let's actually switch a little bit to Russia and what's going on there. So it looks like the before like 2 3 months ago, I said that Russian financial system is in pristine state and everything is perfect. However, and it was more like 4 months ago, probably in May, I discussed that the Russian economy is being hit very hard by the sanctions. And I'm talking not about the oil and gas, that's actually least hit by the sanctions, where the biggest, I would say, holes being created are in industrial production. And that's really going to create huge, if you remember, I mentioned about the production of home appliances like refrigerators, like TVs essentially stopped, like cars stopped, pretty much everything that most people use in their daily life. And that will create huge holes in the Russian, created already huge holes, and eventually it will hit hard Russian government collection of the tax revenues, which is it started hitting about I think sometime in August, and now Russian budgets has switched from being having surplus or being profitable in a way that your revenues are exceeding your expenses, right? So and into situation when it's in deficit, which means your expenses exceed your revenues, which is actually a typical situation for most of the governments, especially in the West. They're deeply in sort of like red in terms of collecting less than they spending. For Russia, it's unusual situation. The state finances has been kept in pristine situation, pristine conditions since quite a while, since probably sometimes in 2000s. And that one of the reasons they accumulated huge pile of the savings reserves. That's half of them, I think, actually they were frozen in the West, but then somehow they managed to keep the half of those reserves still under control. And I think, yeah. So this whole situation dynamic is changing, and now the Russian economy does not generate enough sort of profits. That doesn't generate enough of the tax revenues. The all of this mobilization creating huge expenses for the Russian budget, because all of these people, and that's probably, I don't know if I mentioned this, all of these mobilized people, they getting paid pretty handsomely. They essentially getting paid like the same as all of those contract soldiers, which is 200,000 plus Russian rubles per month if you on the front line. So that is pretty. And if you think about what the at least like sort of like a sort of mentioned number of 300,000, which is going to be much more, by the way. But that really huge amount outflow of money that needs to be spent by the government. And what the result of it is that Russian ruble started to go into negative relative to US dollar. If you remember, sometime in April, May, there was a lot of Russian pride and Russian propaganda pride that like, we actually managed to stabilize our currency, and it actually become much stronger relative to US dollar and euro. Obviously, this, I'm just going to be calling US dollar just to make it sort of shorter, but I'm referring both currencies. And so it used to be like into like in mid 70s before the war. Then it really jumped to like 150, 100, almost 170, and then it went down to like mid 50s. So now it's steadily going down again. So right now it's about 64 Russian rubles per US dollar. Again, this is not. First of all, I want to just make one caveat about all of this. Yes, this system is not sort of correct, not perfect, because it's been manipulated by the Russian government. So you don't have like true market. But even in this distorted system, it's sort of showing direction for the Russian currency south, right? And now it's a clear trend and a consistent trend, and I explain why. Because the economy is falling apart, and also there are problems with all of this oil and gas sales, coal sales, because again I discussed that what is Federal Reserve is doing, it's increasing interest rates, which kills demand in the West and throughout the world, and in very painful way. And I think many of the viewers will feel that pain pretty soon. It's not just some hypothetical, just generic pain. It's like sewing off someone's leg without any narcotics to remove the pain. I mean, and obviously it's unnecessary sort of sewing off the leg, but that's what's being done essentially as like in a way knee-jerk reaction to the situation when the inflation is out of control, and it's actually out of control due to the action of the governments in the West. So it's self-inflicted pain generally, right? But because of the Federal Reserve, they don't have the tool to stop government deficits. So the only tool they have is interest rate. So they use interest rate to effectively stop those governmental deficits, which is what I discussed, that the governments are permanently in red, where expenses exceed the revenues. And so so now this is what's happening, and those actions by Federal Reserve, they kill even demand for oil and gas, right? I mean, it's not kill there's still demand, because it's such an essential thing to everything, because literally economy needs to literally stop for demand to sort of fall tremendously. But still it's putting pressure, and given that Russia needs to sell everything at significant discount, it's becoming a lot less profitable for the Russian oil and gas sector, and it's getting situation slowly getting sort of worse. And eventually, if this continues, the writing on the wall is going to be the Russian economy, Russian state is, and the sort of livelihood of ordinary Russians will get into pretty painful situation that can lead to social unrest in Russia. And this is not going to happen tomorrow, not in a month, not in a two. But if this situation continues for long enough, it can lead to something like that. And that's one of the reasons why I'm saying that Russia is heading to its 1917 moment, the same as actually in Ukraine, because both countries are cannot continue living the way they used to live for different reasons. And then one way or another, they will be sort of reformed, and life in a way take the destiny of both countries in its own hands, and will force those reforms or changes on both countries. And this has nothing to do with sort of like the war or any, like it's not sort of emotional statement. It's just more like okay, things are simply cannot continue the way they were in both countries, and that's a reason why things will change. It's a sort of objective process, has nothing to do with sort of my subjective opinion or anything like that, and has nothing to do with my desire or anyone's desire. It's going to happen no matter what, what wants what, basically. So it's essentially out of control, out of sort of everyone. So this is what's happening there with all of this, and the part of the, and as a result of all of this, there was a statement by the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lavrov, who said that Putin is open to discussing peace with the US, basically with the West, let's put it this way. But obviously US, because from a Russian perspective, Europe is just a puppet of the US. So they're not sovereign from the Russian perspective. And obviously Ukraine is not sovereign either. It's even totally puppet from the Russian perspective, from the way Russia views the situation. And so their view is, okay, we want to discuss, we want to negotiate peace with actual decision maker, which is in Russian eyes is US. So that's why there was that statement, because there is quite of many things are going in the wrong direction in Russia. That Russian leadership is clearly understanding it's better to have some peace than face 1917 moment. Let's put it this way, because they fully aware where this whole thing is going. They pretty intelligent people. Let's put it this way. The problem is that the peace, the way that would be acceptable for Russia, is nearly impossible, because that really means the failure of the West, and the whole sort of whole of this globalized system will collapse even more, essentially, right? Because then it will be understanding that the West has lost its position in the world, and everybody will start doing whatever they, probably not the right way, say whatever they want, but there will be a lot of tensions between in the world, where those tensions were suppressed because of the economic prosperity. Even though it's uneven prosperity, there's not a perfect system by any means, but still that a relative economic prosperity that was created, let's say past let's say whatever 30 years, maybe 40, meaning even for developing world, that suppressed a lot of conflicts in many places around the world. And if that's removed, the whole system starts to disintegrate. There will be a lot of sort of points of tensions and outright wars. Like, for example, you probably hear about this situation between Turkey and Greece, right? Then Azerbaijan and Armenia. There's a lot of those sort of places that sort of we haven't heard in a long time, and they will resurface again, right? And even, for example, if you look at Saudi Arabia, they decided to join Russia in reducing oil output. That's pretty clear sort of blow to the West, right? Showing like, okay, we're gonna maximize our own profits at the expense of the whole system. And you may want to say like, okay, well, they have the right to do it. And I wouldn't say that they don't have right to do that, but this is just one example, and there could be much worse examples. And so that's just what at stake, and that's what actually was said by the, I think, head of NATO, that it's not that Ukraine will lose, it's more that the West will lose in this situation. So, and Ukraine is obviously fighting its own war for its own survival in all of this, right? So it's just, trying to keep its own integrity and keep its own sort of its own hand, like future in its own hands. Even I mentioned that the Ukrainian um, current government is absolutely corrupt, but this whole situation, even this whole economic damage, will basically prevent in the future, will basically destroying ability for the corrupt government to exist in Ukraine, basically, because there is no sort of like exploitative rent that could be squeezed from the economy, because the economy is largely destroyed right now. So that sort of, it's essentially think about like a parasite on the host, and there is no blood left for parasite on the host. So essentially, that will tremendously weaken parasite and creates opportunity for the host to regain itself. And so that's really kind of like what's going on there. And then going back to the Russian mobilization situation, what this Russian command is doing is it's actually sending those newly mobilized soldiers and largely poorly trained to existing frontline units. It's not creating new frontline units, which is actually right move and very correct move, because there is backbone of experienced soldiers on the ground in existing units, and this newly mobilized people, even though they did not receive good training sort of at whatever they at home, whatever they had the training, they will be at least in okay situation, because they will get like sort of like at onward during like the training, like straight there, and they at least have people to learn from, right? So that also ensures that there is transfer of knowledge to the new sort of fresher sort of soldiers. And that also gives ability to consume those mobilized people in efficient way, or relatively efficient way. So that's on the sort of positive side. That really means that um, probably in months or two, once they mobilize enough, or the Russian command feels like they have enough, they may renew large scale offensive if Ukrainian side does not sort of kind of have strong wins in the meanwhile, which as a whole, it looks like Ukrainian side has bogged down at this point. At the same time, Russian sources say that the Ukrainian command is accumulating large groups on North Luhansk front line. And actually, let's move to the to the map. So they claim that Ukrainian command is basically accumulating large attacking forces here in this North Luhansk section of the front, and then in Kherson. So obviously those two areas that we've seen a lot of action. So this is where they expect renewed offensive from Ukrainian side. And partially all of these attacks against all of this electricity infrastructure are attempts to essentially disrupt those future offensive by Ukrainian forces, and buy time for the Russian military system, right? Because and then that's could be this is obviously somewhat speculative, because the other way to do it is to actually destroy the bridges across the Dnipro River. However, to destroy those bridges, you really need a huge number of rockets, let's say 1,000 rockets. And it's very clear that Russian side does not have that many rockets, and they sort of running low on the rockets. So they need to sort of shoot, and with whatever they still have, limited amount, and create as much sort of disruption as possible. The only way to do it is what they're doing is hitting the electricity power grid, because that affects literally everything, including railroad, because then you can only use diesel locomotives as opposed to electrical. So you have let's say, I don't know the distribution between diesel and electrical, but you probably have, at best 60% left, maybe even half left at that point. So that really disrupts the transfer of troops across the country, or everything essentially. Also, on an unrelated note, there are well, not reports. There is confirmation that Ukraine received first IRIS-T system, air defense system from Germany. That's which is great news. But as I mentioned before, that's just simply totally not enough. It's not even drop in a bucket. It's less than a drop in a bucket to defend all of this infrastructure. And at this point, to some extent you can clearly say it's too little, too late. It's not gonna provide sufficient defense at this point, and yeah, and it's too late, as I said. So now let's actually go back to the sort of military situation. Let's just kind of walks through the front line. As I said, there's not much going on. Nevertheless, we'll just I'll do a little bit more discussion here. What's going on in this North Luhansk, in this area of North Donbass, where Wagner mercenaries continuing their sort of advances. So the situation along the state border is somewhat sort of more elevated. Ukrainian Ukrainian troops also attacked one of those transformers on the Russian side. I think it was either Shebekino or Valuki, one of those. So part of the Belgorod region of Russia lost electricity, but it was quickly fixed, because obviously that's a like a tiny hit for the elephant. So it's pretty much nothing. Now let's jump into the North Luhansk section of the front line. So I was able to confirm that Russian troops did not advance and didn't capture this Nevsky, Terne, Dnipro. Basically, they didn't clear this whole area. That was basically lies by Russian propaganda. The situation remains more or less stable, the way it's kind of shown here. And what I just want to reiterate, what happened is Ukrainian command has lost momentum in Ukrainian troops and lost time, which is the most important. Russian side is actively digging in, like they used all of this industrial equipment. It's not just soldiers, so like industrial equipment to dig in and build defensive lines here. And also, as I said, Russian troops are getting more and more of those mobilized soldiers, reinforcements, which puts meat on the bones of all of these units, so they become again somewhat capable, right? So that's at this point, basically this whole concrete becomes harder and harder eventually to break through, and it will require more resources and higher waste of resources, which means higher loss of Ukrainian soldiers to break through all of this. Otherwise, the situation here is for now stable, without any major attacks by either side. Basically, Russian side is actively building, actively digging in and expecting Ukrainian attacks sometime soon. And they claim that Ukrainian command is building a large group of troops to attack soon. We'll see if that's true or not, but that's what they say. Now let's move to North Luhansk section of the front line. So Wagner mercenaries continuing their aggressive attacks, and they making progress, and they again were successful today. They basically pushed Ukrainian troops out of tiny village, you almost want to say hamlet, called Ivangrad here. So as you can see, they slowly kind of building, like engulfing essentially this Bakhmut and turning into the salient, which then will force withdrawal from it. By the way, Ukrainian authorities and Ukrainian military started evacuating all of their like military civilian administration, all essential services are being evacuated from Bakhmut, which again not a great sign, and it's potentially a sign that you know that uh, that Bakhmut can be lost. I'm not saying it's gonna be lost, but there is preparation that it can be potentially lost. So that option is on the table. It's obviously nobody wants that to happen, but looking at their sort of distribution, the balance of the forces, it seems like that's potential option. What's really happening right now here in Bakhmut, which is not visible from the map, is essentially there is a river that's called Bakhmutka that kind of goes through this town, and it's essentially kind of a little bit goes parallel to this road that I'm showing. This is kind of like a main road, so it kind of goes parallel. So this is the main part of the town on the western side of that river, and the eastern part is smaller, and it's so it looks like where this is what's going to happen is that Ukrainian troops probably will withdraw from this eastern part of Bakhmut and kind of like move to the western part of it and kind of try to sort of continue defenses there. Essentially, that's what's likely is going to happen out of this sort of like as immediate or not immediate but near future situation here. Now let's move south to central Donbass section of the front line. Things here essentially without many changes. Russian troops continuing their attacks out of Piskeseli, and as I said before, they slowly but gaining ground. They slowly moving west. They are in this village called Pervomaisky, which is straight west of Piski, and they kind of moving through that village slowly but surely. However, that's the only kind of like area of advance that they where they been having success for the past whatever 2-3 months here. Now let's quickly look at the Zaporizhya front line. Things here are sort of stable for since the beginning of the time, as I say. Nothing really changing here. An expectation that this probably will remain quiet section of the front line because Ukrainian command decided to sort of first clear this Kherson bridgehead, and obviously this is another opportunity that where Ukrainian troops remain focused. So there's simply not enough resources for this area, and this area will require quite a bit of resources and skills because it's super hard to attack in this area where everything is very open terrain, and partially for that reason, it was so hard on Kherson bridgehead, especially if Ukrainian troops lack the skills. So then it becomes really hard. Now let's actually look at Kherson bridgehead. As discussed, the situation, the fate of the Russian troops here is sealed unless there is some dramatic change of the war, or like let's say Russian troops use some tactical nuclear weapons. But if things are going the way they're going, this is going to be lost. It's only question of time. There were some reports, satellite images, that Russian troops managed to rebuild pontoon bridges over here near Darivka, over this Ingolets River, and apparently they were successful for some time since the beginning of October, to basically transfer resources between the two sort of pieces of the bridgehead, and obviously feeding this bridgehead here because again, as we mentioned before, the main bridges are no longer usable. So again, they also use ferries and pontoon bridges to feed all of these troops here. At the same time, as I mentioned before, the feeding is not enough relative to expenditure of the ammunition, and that creates sort of this ammunition, slowly but surely, ammunition hunger on the Russian side. There were some pretty weak attempts by Ukrainian troops to attack here from sort of like in the south eastern direction and out of this Borozensky area without much success, as discussed. This is also, how to say, pretty well fortified Russian position at this point. They have artillery in the back that can support Russian troops and essentially fend off Ukrainian offensives. And it's going to take quite a bit of time for Ukrainian artillery to weaken Russian artillery in counter battery fire. So this is again, we're going into another sort of like a turn of the situation when it's going to be slow weakening of Russian defenses, and then sort of the floodgates will open very quickly. But before we get to that, it will take a while again, unless there is decision by Ukrainian command to sort of throw huge number of troops at once. But that may create huge losses as well. So again, this is probably slow strategy, but it minimizes expense, sort of losses, especially in human lives. And in any ways, it guarantees sort of results. The only thing is, it was pretty surprising to see that those pontoon bridges have been used for a while over in Let's River. Apparently, the use of HIMARS systems is not as sort of not as efficient, let's put this way, and there is room to sort of for improvement. That's all I can say about that. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and until tomorrow, bye bye.